The chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Small Business Administration, Jovita Carranza of Illinois to be administrator.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Jovita Carranza of Illinois to be administrator of the Small Business Administration, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the nays be waived.
Without objection.
I ask consent the mandatory quorum call be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business that senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I understand there's a bill at the desk to do a second reading.
The clerk will recite the bill for the second time.
S. 3148, a bill to amend the Controlled Substances Act to list fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I controlled substances.
In order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceeding.
An objection being heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar.
I understand the chair received a letter of resignation of the former Senator Johnny Isakson of Georgia, which was effective at 5 p.m. on Tuesday, December 31st, 2019.
The distinguished leader is correct.
I ask unanimous consent the letter be considered as having been read and that it be spread upon the journal and printed in the record.
Without objection.
I need to do anything. No, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent when the Senate completes its business today at adjourn until 3 p.m. Monday, January the 6th. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. Further, following leader remarks, the Senate proceed to executive session and resume consideration of the Carranza nomination. Finally, that the cloture motion filed during today's session ripen at 5:30 Monday.
Without objection.
I suggest that before.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
The distinguished minority leader is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, I just heard Leader McConnell. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, I just heard Leader McConnell speak for 30 minutes on the subject of the President's impeachment. There was a lot of finger-pointing, name-calling, and misreading of history, but not a single argument or discussion about the issue that's holding up a Senate trial, whether there will be witnesses and documents. Not one mention. He has no good argument against having witnesses and documents, so he resorts to these subterfuges. I'll have more to say on impeachment momentarily, but I first want to address the issue of Iran. Last night, the United States conducted a military operation designed to kill Major General Qasem Soleimani, a notorious terrorist. No one should shed a tear over his death. The operation against Soleimani in Iraq was conducted, however, without specific authorization and any advance notification or consultation with Congress. I'm a member of the Gang of Eight, which is typically briefed in advance of operations of this level of significance. We were not. The lack of advance consultation and transparency with Congress was put in the Constitution, or rather the need for advance consultation and transparency with Congress was put in the Constitution for a reason, because the lack of advance consultation and transparency with Congress can lead to hasty and ill-considered decisions. When the security of the nation is at stake, decisions must not be made in a vacuum. The framers of the Constitution gave war powers to the legislature and made the executive the commander-in-chief for the precise reason of forcing the two branches of government to consult with one another when it came to matters of war and of peace. It is paramount for administrations to get an outside view to prevent groupthink and rash action, to be asked probing questions, not from your inner and often insulated circle, but from others, particularly Congress, which forces an administration, before it acts, to answer very serious questions. The administration did not consult in this case, and I fear that those very serious questions have not been answered and may not be fully considered. Among those questions, what was the legal basis for conducting this operation, and how far does that legal basis extend? Iran has many dangerous surrogates in the region and a whole range of possible responses. Which responses do we expect? Which are most likely? Do we have plans to counter all of the possible responses? How effective will our counters be? What does this action mean for the long-term stability of Iraq and the trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives sacrificed there? How does the administration plan to manage an escalation of hostilities? And how does the administration plan to avoid a larger and potentially endless conflagration in the Middle East? These are questions that must be answered. It is my view that the President does not have the authority for a war with Iran. If he plans a large increase in troops and potential hostility over a longer time, the administration will require congressional approval and the approval of the American people. The President's decision may add to an already dangerous and difficult situation in the Middle East. The risk of a much longer military engagement in the Middle East is acute and immediate. This action may well have brought our nation closer to another endless war, exactly the kind of endless war the President promised he would not drag us into. As our citizens and those of our allies evacuate Iraq and troops prepare for retaliatory action, Congress needs answers to these questions and others from the administration immediately. And the American people need answers as well. On impeachment. Mr. President, the Senate begins this new session of Congress preparing to do something that has happened only twice before in American history, serving as a court of impeachment in a trial of the President of the United States. President Donald Trump stands accused by the House of Representatives of committing one of the offenses the Founding Fathers most feared when it came to the stability of the Republic, abusing the powers of his office for personal gain, soliciting the interference of a foreign power in our elections to benefit himself. The House has also charged the President with obstructing Congress in the investigation into those matters. The consequence of an unprecedented blockade of relevant witnesses and documents, flatly denying the legislative branch's constitutional authority to provide oversight of the executive. As all eyes turn to the Senate, the question before us is, will we fulfill our duty to conduct a fair impeachment trial of the President of the United States, or will we not? That is the most pressing question facing the Senate at the outset of this second session of the 116th Congress. Will we conduct a fair trial that examines all the facts or not? The country just saw Senator McConnell's answer to that question. His answer is no. Instead of trying to find the truth, he is still using the same feeble talking points that he was using last December. The country just saw how the Republican leader views his responsibility at this pivotal moment in our nation's history. The Republican leader prefers finger-pointing and name-calling to avoid answering the looming question: why shouldn't the Senate call witnesses? The Republican leader hasn't given one good reason why there shouldn't be relevant witnesses or relevant documents. We did not hear one from Leader McConnell today or any day. Once again, Leader McConnell tried to bury his audience under an avalanche of partisan recriminations and misleading references to precedents. There is only one precedent that matters here, that never in the history of our country has there been an impeachment trial of the President in which the Senate was denied the ability to hear from witnesses. Let me repeat that. That is the salient fact here. There is only one precedent that matters. There has never in the history of our country been an impeachment trial of the President in which the Senate was denied the ability to hear from witnesses. Yet the Republican leader seems intent on violating that precedent and denying critical evidence to this body and to the American people. Leader McConnell has been clear and vocal that he has no intention to be impartial in this process. Leader McConnell reminds us, today and in previous days, that rather than acting like a judge and a juror, he intends to act as the executioner of a fair trial. Thankfully, the rules of the impeachment trial will be determined by the majority of senators in this chamber, not by the Republican leader alone. The crux of the issue still is whether the Senate will hear testimony from witnesses and receive documentary evidence directly relevant to the charges against the President. Since Congress recessed for the holidays, there have been several events that have significantly bolstered my argument for 4 specific witnesses and specific categories of documents. Nothing in that time has bolstered Leader McConnell's argument that there shouldn't be relevant witnesses or documents. On December 21st, the Center for Public Integrity obtained emails through a Freedom of Information Act request that showed that Michael Duffy, a top OMB official and one of the 4 witnesses I've requested, asked the Defense Department to, quote, hold off on sending military aid to Ukraine 91 minutes after President Trump's July phone call with Ukrainian President Zelensky. On December 29th, the New York Times report included several revelations about the extent of Chief Mulvaney's involvement in the delayed military assistance, about the effort by lawyers at OMB, Justice, and the White House to create legal justifications for the delay in assistance, and about the depth of opposition to, and indeed, alarm about, the delay in military assistance from parts of the administration, particularly the Pentagon. Then, just yesterday, there was a new report about a trove of newly unredacted emails that further exposed the serious concerns raised by Trump administration officials about the propriety and legality of the President's decision to delay military assistance to Ukraine. One of those emails were released yesterday was from Michael Duffy, one of the witnesses we've requested, to the Pentagon controller, and it read, quote, "Clear direction from POTUS, the President, to continue the hold." Clear direction from the President to continue the hold, is what Duffy wrote. What constituted clear direction? Did Michael Duffy get an order from the President? Or did someone like Mr. Mulvaney get an order from the President that was passed on to Mr. Duffy? Were there discussions by administration officials about covering up the reasons for the President directing the delay in military assistance? These are questions that can only be answered by examination of the documentary evidence and by the testimony of key Trump administration officials under oath in a Senate trial. These developments are a devastating blow to Leader McConnell's push to have a trial without the documents and witnesses we've requested. Each new revelation mounts additional pressure on the members of this chamber to seek the whole truth. With these new emails, we're getting certain portions of the truth. We need the whole truth. For example, much of the evidence that was obtained by the recent FOIA requests has been heavily redacted. Here is an email chain between officials at the Pentagon regarding the Politico article that first revealed the Trump administration was delaying military assistance to Ukraine. It is completely redacted. Every word crossed out, not available, can't be seen. Here's another email with the subject line, "Apportionment," between officials at OMB and the Pentagon, completely redacted. None of the words can be seen at all. We know now that some of these redactions were covered up, but only some of it. Why did they redact the sections they redacted? Who ordered the redactions? Why are they covering up? What are they hiding? These questions must be asked. When you are accused of something, you don't suppress evidence that will exonerate you. The fact that the administration is going to such lengths to prevent such emails from coming out is extraordinarily telling. It seems like they themselves feel they are guilty. Getting the full documentary record would undoubtedly shed light on the issues at hand. These were senior Trump officials discussing the delay in military assistance to Ukraine. Who ordered it, why it was ordered, whether or not it was legal, and how it was connected to the effort to pressure Ukraine into announcing investigations regarding a political rival of the President. And these emails represent just a sliver of the documentary evidence that exists in this case. There was an exceedingly strong case to call witnesses and request documents before the Senate went out of session for the Christmas break. In the short time since, that case has gotten stronger, and remarkably so. We are not asking for critics of the President to serve as witnesses in the trial. We are asking only that the President's men, his top advisors, tell their side of the story. And Leader McConnell, once again, has been unable to make one argument, one single argument, as to why these witnesses and these documents should not be part of a trial. Now, I want to respond to one suggestion by Leader McConnell, that we follow the 1999 example of beginning the impeachment trial first and then deciding on witnesses and documents at a later date. First, to hear McConnell say no witnesses now, but maybe some later, is just another indication he has no argument against witnesses and documents on the merits. Will Leader McConnell commit to witnesses and documents now and discuss timing later? Second, Leader McConnell's comparisons to 1999 are hopelessly flawed and inaccurate. There were witnesses in 1999, Leader McConnell. You want the precedent of 1999, there were witnesses, as there were in every single impeachment trial of the president in history. It would be a break in precedent for there not to be witnesses. Third, there was even a greater rationale for witnesses in the Clinton trial. In 1999, the witnesses in question had already testified. They had already testified under oath, extensively. And there were also bipartisan concerns about the suitability of the subject matter for the floor of the Senate. There's no analogy to today's situation. The witnesses we've requested never testified under oath, and the documents we've requested have not been produced. Fourth, we have a tradition in America of a fair and speedy trial. That's why we've requested only the relevant information up front, so that the trial can truly be speedy and fair. It makes no sense, and in fact, it is a ruse to suggest that the Senate wait until the end of the trial to settle the hardest question, when it might take time for witnesses to prepare testimony and for the Senate to review new documentary evidence. We can and should begin that process now and ensure that the trial is informed by the facts and does not suffer unnecessary delays. Fifth, and finally, when Leader McConnell suggests we have both sides present their arguments and then deal with witnesses, he is essentially proposing to conduct the whole trial and then, once the trial is basically over, consider the question of evidence. That makes no sense. That's Alice in Wonderland logic. The trial must be informed by the evidence, not the other way around. The House managers should be allowed to present all of the evidence to make their case, not make their case and then afterward ask for evidence we know is out there. So, if we don't get a commitment up front that the House managers will be able to call witnesses as part of their case, the Senate will act as little more than a nationally televised meeting of the mock trial club. If we leave the question of witnesses and documents until after all the presentations are complete, Leader McConnell will argue that the Senate's heard enough, we shouldn't prolong the trial any longer. At that point, you can be sure he'll label anyone who wants to subpoena evidence as a partisan, who wants to drag the whole affair out. I know this because he's already told us what his position will be. This is not a mystery. Quote, after we've heard the arguments, Leader McConnell said on Fox News, we ought to vote and move on. Does that sound like someone in good faith who intends to have the Senate reasonably consider witnesses at a later date? No, it does not. Leader McConnell's proposal to vote on witnesses and documents later is nothing more than a poorly disguised trap. After we've heard the arguments, Leader McConnell said, we ought to vote and move on. All of my fellow senators, Democrat and Republican, should take stock of the leader's words and remember the commitment he made on national television to take his cues from the White House. So I say to the chair, it may feel like we are no closer to establishing the rules for a Senate trial than when we last met. But the question, the vital question of whether or not we have a fair trial ultimately rests with a majority of the senators in this chamber. The President faces gravely serious charges abuse of power, abuse of his public trust, soliciting the interference of a foreign power in our elections, unprecedented obstruction of Congress, and if convicted, the President faces the most severe punishment our Constitution imagines. The framers gave us, this chamber, the United States Senate, the sole power to discharge this most difficult and somber duty. Will the Senate rise to the occasion? I yield the floor.
The chair recognizes the distinguished senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I start by thanking Senator Schumer, the minority leader, for his pursuit of a fair impeachment trial here in the United States Senate, something supported by the overwhelming majority of the American people, whether they be Republicans, Democrats, or independents. And the Senate will soon undertake this most serious of its duties, considering the impeachment of a president. None of us relish this moment, but we all have a solemn responsibility under the Constitution to try this case, to assess the evidence and render a fair judgment. We will hear a case from the House of Representatives and from the President's lawyers, and we will first be sworn in to do, quote, impartial justice according to the Constitution and the laws, unquote. Mr. President, while senators are primarily expected to listen to the evidence and weigh that evidence, we also have a special ability that most juries do not have. We can request additional information. We can request witnesses. We can request documents. And it only takes a simple majority, 51 senators, to call witnesses and request those documents. And in the two other times in the history of the Senate when we have considered a presidential impeachment, we have required witnesses to testify directly or give sworn depositions. In President Clinton's impeachment trial, 3 witnesses were deposed, even though they had all given prior sworn testimony in related proceedings. At that time, now Majority Leader McConnell called their request for testimony, quote, modest, a modest request. Mr. President, Senate Democrats have another modest request that's pending today. We would like to hear from 4 witnesses who have not testified previously, who did not testify in the House, who have not testified under penalty of perjury like we saw other House witnesses testify. And why is that? That is because President Trump has ordered them not to testify. Those 4 witnesses are White House Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, former National Security Advisor John Bolton, and top administration officials Michael Duffy and Robert Blair. We are also asking the Senate to request key documents that the President has refused to provide. We know these are relevant witnesses. We know it even more after the reporting from this week, which has shown that these 4 witnesses have clear, firsthand knowledge of withholding congressionally appropriated funds for Ukraine to fight Russian aggression, one of the actions at the center of the House's abuse of power charge. Newly revealed emails, which the Trump administration tried to keep secret, show that just 91 minutes after President Trump had his call with Ukrainian President Zelensky, Mr. Duffy emailed the Department of Defense and their officials to inform them that the administration would formally withhold military assistance for Ukraine. We know that days after the phone call, Mr. Duffy, a political appointee, took over the Ukraine portfolio from a career civil servant at OMB under the guise of wanting to, quote, learn about the apportionment process. The administration claims that the reason for the hold was to conduct a review of Ukraine assistance, even though the hold was formally ordered on the same day that President Trump personally pressured President Zelensky to investigate Vice President Joe Biden and the 2016 election in order to boost President Trump's personal political agenda. Mr. President, there's no evidence that any real review of assistance to Ukraine took place, and none of the emails about the hold on assistance discuss any review actually happening. Instead, we now know that Mr. Duffy tried to keep the hold a secret, known to as few people as possible. Here is what he wrote in his email informing the Department of Defense about the hold. Quote, given the sensitive nature of the request, I appreciate your keeping that information closely held to those who need to know to execute the direction, unquote. We also know that OMB would eventually issue 9 of what they called footnotes from July to September to delay releasing the congressional authorized funding for assistance to Ukraine. The emails that have surfaced also reveal that the Defense Department raised concerns that the hold was breaking the law, something the administration has tried to hide. Congress, many years ago, passed a law called the Impoundment Control Act to address situations like this, where funding is provided in law, but the president, whoever the president may be, refuses to spend it. The Impoundment Control Act only allows the executive branch to withhold funding in very limited circumstances, and it requires the president to notify Congress when he withholds legally appropriated funding, something President Trump never did when he withheld assistance to Ukraine. In addition to abusing his power by pressuring Ukraine to interfere in our elections, I think the evidence will also show that President Trump violated the Impoundment Control Act. I have asked the Government Accountability Office to look into this and give us an independent legal opinion. GAO is working on this now, and as part of their review, they asked the Trump administration to explain what happened. In their response, OMB claimed that the Defense Department's general counsel never told OMB that the hold would legally prevent the funds from being spent before they expired at the end of the fiscal year. Thanks to newly revealed emails, in fact, emails that we saw in their unredacted form for the first time yesterday, we know that this was, at best, extremely misleading. As the hold continued, Defense Department officials repeatedly raised concerns about its legality. In an email sent on August 27th, the Defense Department shared a draft letter that they had prepared to send to OMB that included the following sentence about continuing to withhold funding for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, called USAI for short. Here's what they wrote, quote, as a result, we have repeatedly advised OMB officials that pauses beyond August 19, 2019 jeopardize the Department's ability to obligate USAI funding prudently and fully consistent with the Impoundment Control Act. So here we have Defense Department officials directly relating concerns about the hold breaking the law, despite what OMB said to GAO. Mr. President, here's what we saw earlier. This is one of the emails, redacted emails. This is the draft letter I just referred to that had been prepared for the signature of the Deputy Secretary of Defense. It's addressed to Mr. Vogt. He's the acting director over at OMB. So when the administration first released the emails in response to a Freedom of Information request, something the administration didn't want to do but was required by law, they decided to black out this entire email, redact it. What we learned yesterday was that this blackout contained the sentences that I just read about the Department of Defense being very, very worried that continued withholding violated the law, violated the Impoundment Control Act. Now, I can't imagine how in good faith the Justice Department or whoever it was in the administration just blacked this out. I'm told it was the Attorney General. That is an abuse of power to deny that information to the American people and to the Congress, and this appears to be just the tip of the iceberg. Ultimately, we know that the president's hold on the Ukraine funds continued until September 12th, and the Defense Department was unable to deliver $35 million of that vitally needed aid to Ukraine before the funds expired at the end of the fiscal year. It was only because Congress later acted by a vote of both houses of Congress to extend that funding that the Defense Department can now deliver this assistance. This is why it's all the more important for the Senate to hear testimony from the witnesses under oath, under penalty of perjury, and to review the relevant documents for ourselves. Mr. Mulvaney, Mr. Blair, and Mr. Duffy were all directly involved in carrying out President Trump's order to withhold Ukraine assistance, and Mr. Bolton, according to the testimony of Dr. Fiona Hill, raised significant concerns about the hold. Mr. President, so far as we just heard, the Majority Leader, Senator McConnell, has rejected these reasonable requests for witnesses and documents, despite the fact that they are clearly directly relevant to the impeachment trial. And so I think people have a very simple question. Why is the President, why is the Majority Leader so desperate, so scared to provide these documents and prevent these individuals from testifying under penalty of perjury? It's been deeply disappointing to hear the Majority Leader say that he is, quote, not an impartial juror, unquote, and that he will work in lockstep with the President's lawyers. He's asking the Senate to allow the defendant in this case, the President of the United States, to set the terms of his own trial. This is not just an affront to our constitutional duty, it defies justice and common sense. Make no mistake, those who vote to block the Senate from considering additional evidence from witnesses and documents are going to be complicit in rigging a trial and in a cover-up. I would challenge my colleagues to tell me one case where, after you have a grand jury proceeding, that the prosecution is not allowed to call witnesses at trial. That would be nuts. And so for the Senate to deliberately choose to close its eyes and shut its ears to evidence would be a miscarriage of justice and a violation of our constitutional obligations. I heard the Majority Leader talk about how the Speaker of the House is holding up sending the impeachment proceedings, the articles of impeachment. Well, Mr. President, if the Majority Leader were to just agree to do what we allow in every other trial in the country, which is call relevant witnesses and get relevant documents, we could start this trial tomorrow. So it is the refusal of the Majority Leader to agree to what overwhelming majority of Americans consider common sense and plain justice that we're experiencing whatever delay we end up experiencing in this case. The House has presented overwhelming evidence to support its 2 articles of impeachment: abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. But the Senate trial is about hearing the cases on both sides, including hearing from those who were directly involved before rendering a final verdict. President Trump has said many times he wants to call witnesses. He wants to have a full trial. And if he has evidence to rebut the facts established by the House, the Senate needs to hear it, and we should render a final verdict after all the evidence is in, and not before. Some may have heard our Republican colleagues argue that we need to rush to trial to get back to legislative business. First, let's remember that impeachment is our constitutional responsibility, and we can have a trial that is both speedy and fair. Second, as we have seen in the House of Representatives, it's possible to conduct robust oversight and legislate at the same time. In fact, the week before the House of Representatives voted on impeachment, they passed a very important bill to reduce the costs of prescription drugs. In fact, the House has passed over 300 bills that Senator McConnell has refused to bring up for a vote here in the United States Senate, including hundreds with bipartisan support. The House has acted to expand background checks for gun purchases to reduce gun violence, passed legislation to get big money out of politics, to strengthen voting rights, to raise the minimum wage for the first time in more than a decade, to protect employee pensions, and to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. Mr. President, Senator McConnell has not only blocked consideration of these critical measures, he has boasted about his obstruction, calling himself the, quote, Grim Reaper. So let's not fall for the claim that the majority leader suddenly wants to get to work on these initiatives that are important to the American people. To date, he has made no commitment to take up any of those bills, whether or not there's an impeachment trial. As the Senate discharges its constitutional duties, whether by conducting an impeachment trial or passing legislation, it should never be an instrument of a president, regardless of party. We should not be a rubber stamp. We should never outsource our judgment or our votes to any White House. We serve the American people and must render justice fairly and honorably at this critical time in our history. Now, Mr. President, speaking of critical moments, I do want to say a word about the rapidly escalating conflict with Iran. General Soleimani was a violent man who died a violent death. But the question facing us is not whether the target of the attack was a good or bad man. The question is, what will be the consequence of this action taken by the United States? And more broadly, what is President Trump's strategy for moving forward to advance U.S. national interests in the region and the safety of Americans? President Trump came into office saying he wanted to end America's wars in the Middle East. But today we are closer to war with Iran than ever before. And the administration's reckless policy over the last 3 years has brought us to this brink. Make no mistake, from day one, President Trump and ideologues within his administration have escalated tensions with Iran without a strategy. They launched their deliberate maximum pressure campaign without any realistic goals. Can anyone tell us today what President Trump's endgame is with respect to Iran? Everything we have seen over the last 3 years has demonstrated that this president is not capable of thinking beyond the first move in a chess game and has been surrounded by ideological sycophants, not regional or national security experts, but people who are eager to please his whims and who have no capacity for the sophisticated conflict escalation management that will now be required more than ever to avoid an all-out war with Iran, a war that would harm our country in ways we cannot imagine today, strategically, economically, and loss of life. Mr. President, the stated goal of the action taken was to protect American lives. But Americans throughout the region are at greater risk today than they were yesterday. That's why our embassy in Iraq advised Americans to leave quickly. Our embassies and personnel across the region are now in even more danger, not just in Baghdad, but elsewhere in the area and, in fact, around the world. American troops have become even bigger targets. And what about the American humanitarian organizations and their personnel abroad? American students, American tourists. They are all at greater risk as a result of the action taken. Mr. President, Secretary Pompeo's call today for de-escalation after the assassination is a pipe dream. What we do know, and no one should be surprised, is that Iran has stated that the assassination of the general is tantamount to a declaration of war, and they will strike back at a place and time of their choosing. We know with certainty that a response will come, and that Iran and its allies have the ability to act against Americans and American interests across the region. Moreover, the assassination will likely lead to a decline in American influence in Iraq, and as a result, even greater Iranian power and influence in that country. Our ally, the Iraqi government, has already stated that the attack on its soil violated its sovereignty. Prime Minister Mahdi called for an extraordinary session of the Iraqi parliament to safeguard Iraq's sovereignty, calling the strike, quote, a dangerous escalation that will light the fuse of a destructive war in Iraq, the region, and the world. And Iraq's president, Barham Saleh, also condemned the strikes. Here's the Reuters piece. Iraq president condemns U.S. strike, urges restraint. These are our allies in the Iraqi government, condemning these actions and saying that they will lead to a spiral toward war. And these statements come just days after both the Iraqi prime minister and the president had made similar warnings about prior American actions in Iraq. So this is already intensifying calls within Iraq to expel U.S. forces. And who do we think is going to fill the vacuum there? Iran. They already have enormous influence in Iraq, and now we are going to be giving them even more. This administration, like the Bush administration, has never understood basic political geography. Iran is a large Shia country that borders Iraq. Iraq is also a majority Shia country, and ever since the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 and removed Saddam Hussein, Iran's influence in Iraq has steadily grown. And the assassination may appear gratifying in the short term. As I said, he was a bad person who had a lot of blood on his hands. But it has likely ushered in the most volatile moment in the Middle East in a very, very long time. The same group of warmongering political ideologues who told Americans that the Iraq War would lead to democracy breaking out in the Middle East are telling us today that the Iranians will be celebrating in the streets. The truth is that this action will likely usher in the most militant parliament in Iran that we have seen in decades. The door will be closed completely on the hard-won moment for trying to derail Iranian nuclear ambitions through negotiations. Mr. President, in closing, this is a pivotal and dangerous moment for America. And it has the result of reckless policies over the last 3 years. The President's action may become the spark that could trigger another war in the Middle East. And let us here in Congress make very clear that President Trump has no authority to take America to war against Iran. Our Constitution requires that Congress authorize any decision to go to war, and Congress has not given that authorization. So, Mr. President, in the days and weeks ahead, I hope all of us will do our duty as senators to look at the situation we find ourselves in at this moment. And I hope we will resolve to do what President Trump said he wanted to do while he was campaigning for president, which is not plunge us into more wars in the Middle East, but to find a way to use our influence and our power responsibly to stabilize the situation there. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I ask that the Senate stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate will stand adjourned until 3 p.m. on Monday, January 6th.